Okay, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Wake up, Colfax. All right, just a reminder, we have 1 week until homecoming.
Wow.
To Scott and maybe my consternation. Oh, lots of stuff to do.
Yes.
At any rate, homecoming is next Sunday, September 21st at 2 o'clock. Again, remember to invite folks. We're going to be, church is going to be providing meat. I think it's going to be ham and chicken. I stopped at Sam's earlier this week on a personal shopping trip mostly and was investigating the hams, and they don't have those really nice spiral hams this time of season, but I think we have some other options. So just ask that you bring a dish or a side dish and coordinate with Missy. Mom and I will be doing green beans.
I'll thank Connie for the decorating. She's got it ready.
Oh,
Yes,
yeah.
it's beautiful.
It's
Yes,
pretty,
it does.
Yeah, it looks real nice.
It
Brightens
does.
it
Thanks,
up.
Connie. That's
It's
your
your
fault?
what?
All right.
Gee, bookkeeping, don't bother her.
Okay. All right. This week we were in before all things in Colossians 1 verses 15 to 23. We're somewhere around AD 60 to 62, and this is Paul writing from Rome. In this lesson, we get information about Jesus' involvement at creation. I don't know about you, but I often think of Jesus as first existing when he was born on earth to Mary. But as the Son of God, he pre-existed creation, just as God did. As mentioned, the author of Colossians is Paul. And why was Paul writing this lesson, or this letter, at least in this section of the book? The Colossian believers were under attack from false teachers who were urging them to engage in practices not required of Christ's disciples. And those teachers were likely using a fear of powerful spiritual entities as motivation. And I kind of wonder if that was kind of like a holdover to the pagan gods. Because remember, the pagans, and up until recently, that included the Colossians in the church, who were urging, or who were trying to ensure compliance through threat of fear because they were very powerful pagan gods. But here, the Colossian believers needed to know they could repel this attack upon their beliefs without fear by clinging to Jesus as the head of their church. And Paul wanted to drive home the point to the Colossians that Jesus the Son is equal with God the Father in every way. And Jesus' worldwide rule and redemption are completely trustworthy. So, in other words, the Colossians did not need in the church to try to cover all their bases. Because we have a regrettable tendency to do that. It's like, well, somebody will say, I'll believe, but just in case I'm wrong, I'm going to do these other things too. And Paul's trying to tell the Colossians, no, don't do that. You don't need to cover all your bases. Interestingly, verses 15 through 20 in today's reading could have been an adaptation by Paul of an early Christian hymn, with a few tweaks by Paul to fit the Colossians' particular situation. Apparently, the first half of the hymn would have been reflected in verses 15 through 17, and that the first half of the hymn praises Jesus for all his creative work, and then it parallels that in the second half, which praises Jesus for his reconciling work, which is in verses 18 through 20 in our reading today. All right, we start with Christ's preeminence over all creation. They're really wordy titles this week, so they tended to bleed over into a second line. All right, we start off, apparently I didn't pull things down quite far enough. We start off with Christ's identity in creation in verse 15. Who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature? This is the only verse. Verse 15 is the only verse in our reading today that includes a direct reference to God the Father. The remaining verses actually avoid a direct reference to God the Father. But here, Paul begins his praise by calling Jesus the visible and perfect image of the invisible God. So when Jesus manifested as a human man, we as humans, for the first time, could see an unseeable God, so to speak. The firstborn of every creature phrase. Normally, we would consider firstborn to refer to a physical birth order. And so that kind of raises a question, did Paul mean Jesus is the firstborn of every creature as being the first created being? And the answer to that is no, and we see that answer in the next verse because that dispels that particular interpretation. But if you look at it in the context of Old Testament times, being the physical firstborn son conferred or granted rights to the best part of his father's inheritance to that physically firstborn son. So firstborn here refers to that other connotation, the privilege in addition to birth order. And you also, if you look back in the Old Testament, God refers sometimes to Israel as his son. So in the Old Testament, firstborn, if you interpret this in the context of the times in which it was written, firstborn refers theologically to the status of God's chosen and preeminent person or nation. So by calling Jesus the firstborn of all creatures, Paul is actually acknowledging Jesus as the highest being in the universe. Moving on to verses 16 and 17, the reasons for Christ's identity in creation. For by him were all things created, that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him. And he is before all things, and by him all things consist. And I italicized a few phrases in here, the by him, the for him. In verse 16, by him, it declares that Paul's declaring that all things, without exception, were created through Jesus Christ, and they were created for him. To support Paul's claim that Jesus is in the top position in the universe, Paul expounds on Christ's relationship with creation. Jesus is not merely the greatest in the universe. He rules over all of it. He made all of it. The terms that Paul uses in verse 16, the thrones, the dominions, the principalities, the powers, placed in context of Paul's time, those things almost assuredly refer to categories of spiritual beings, not earthly governments or entities, because Colossian culture at that time focused, remember, on fear and worship of such powerful spiritual beings. So Paul understood that demonic entities were behind the worship of those false gods, and they were really a threat to anybody encountering them. Kind of embedded a little bit in verse 16 is an Old Testament prophetic argument that you see from time to time. I'm not real sure I completely got this, but it goes along the lines of the nation's idols consist of the materials that owe their existence to the Creator. And therefore, anybody who worships those idols has no realistic chance of disrupting God's plans. And I kind of took it as even the most powerful gods that were worshipped at that time, the pagan gods, are impotent in the Creator's and Jesus's presence. These spiritual powers in humans can pursue their own selfish ends, attempting to steer creation away from its intended goal, Jesus' goal, for a while, but Jesus isn't going to let that go on indefinitely. He'll give it a little rope, but not a whole lot. Eventually that rope comes to an end. So we can be confident at the end that these distorted goals of our fallen world are going to go away, and that only those things that were done for Christ are going to endure.
Amen.
Again, our time on earth here is temporary. Relatively speaking to eternity, it's short. It's a mere drop in the bucket. Christ the Creator, so his existence is not dependent on any part of creation, because he is the Creator. But the flip side is also true. All of creation depends upon Jesus. When Paul uses is and not was before all things in verse 17, he said in 17, and he is before all things, not he was before all things. He's not just merely referring to Christ's chronological existence before creation, in other words, pre-existence. He's referring also to Jesus' self-existence above and apart from creation. And the flip side of that is that Jesus has to be actively involved in every part of creation at every moment. It wasn't just a one and done for him. He didn't have to just make it or create it and sit back and observe how it's working. Jesus has to, because he holds all power, he has to be interactive to hold everything together. All right, moving on to section 2, Christ's preeminence in the new creation. This title sounds kind of the same because when I was typing this out, I had to flip back every once in a while. Granted, it was 4:30 in the morning, but I had to flip back to make sure I wasn't typing something out for the second time. And I wasn't. And again, the titles are kind of wordy, so even more so in this section. So they were two-liners. So going on to Christ's identity in the new creation, verse 18. And he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he might have the preeminence. Paul shifts in this verse from Jesus' creation work to his reconciling work. By calling Christ the beginning, Paul implies that Jesus' resurrection was the start of a new creation, just as glorious as the original one. When he refers to Jesus as the firstborn from the dead, he means it both in time and prominence, because Jesus was the first to get a resurrection body, but Jesus' resurrection opened the door for all of his followers to also receive a resurrection body. And we go back to the reasons for Christ's identity, but this time again in the new creation. For it pleased the Father that in him should all fullness dwell, and having made peace through the blood of his cross, by him to reconcile all things unto himself. By him I say, whether they be things in earth or things in heaven. Just as Paul defended Jesus' preeminence in verse 16, he defends Jesus' preeminence in the new creation here. And he's doing it, apparently there's three prepositional phrases, the in him, by him, unto himself, and apparently that got somehow a little bit garbled when it got translated to English. But back to verse 19, when it says, should all fullness dwell, fullness refers to God himself dwelling in Jesus, because remember we have the Trinity. Now, the third preposition in verse 20, unto himself. That's the reconciliation of all things to God the Father. The question is that as in Paul's other letters? Because that's what he's meaning by unto himself, what Paul means by the phrase unto himself in Paul's other letters. But the question is, does that mean the same thing here? Not really, because if you actually look at the grammar, here, grammatically, unto himself must refer only to the Son. Because if you look at the earlier part of that verse, it's talking about making peace through the blood of the cross, and that's Jesus. So here Paul's presenting the Son as the Father's equal in every way, which is the thrust of what he was trying to get through in part of his message. But he's referring to the Son as the Father's equal in every way by referring to the Son Jesus' role in reconciliation in such similar terms as to the Father's role. Because other places, other letters that Paul wrote, when he said unto himself, he's talking about God's role in reconciliation. But here he's specifically talking about Jesus' role in reconciliation and it being equal in every way to God's role. So Jesus is also the source and the goal of the new creation here. And there's some Old Temple imagery. If you remember, the temple was God's temporary dwelling place because it moved around in the tent. And there was a section of the tent where God dwelt. The God seat, I think. So
Mercy seat. Mercy seat.
The mercy seat, sorry, thank you. But here, Jesus is God's permanent dwelling place. In the Old Testament, people came to the temple to sacrifice animals and to obtain peace with God. But here, people can now come to Jesus, who shed his own blood to obtain peace with God as a proxy on our behalf. That Jesus reconciled the entire creation, not just people. Jesus is the creator of heaven and earth. Jesus is also the reconciler of heaven and earth, restoring and resetting all creation to its original purpose of existing for his sake. And wrapping up, applying Christ's preeminence to believers. Because Paul wanted to, he's talking about things more in general, but he also wanted to apply this to the Colossians, to whom he was writing. Bless you, Cliff. Okay. So Paul starts out, and you that were sometime alienated and enemies in your own mind, or in your mind, by wicked works, yet now hath he reconciled in the body of his flesh through death, to present you holy and unblameable and unreprovable in his sight. Shifting his focus right here. He addresses the Colossian believers directly and explains how this applies to them. The Colossians had once been as far away from reconciliation as they could get. They'd been aligned with powerful spirits and therefore alienated from Jesus. But in verse 21, Paul says, yet now. That's Jesus' abrupt interjection into the lives of those believers. Moving on to verse 22. Here are the three prepositions. In the body of his flesh, through death, and in his sight. Paul's directly applying this to the Colossians, the truths he just declared about Jesus. They were reconciled in the body of his flesh from death through death to be presented in his sight. Being presented before Christ as holy and blameless reflects the wedding imagery that I had mentioned. And Paul had used that in other letters, referring to the church as Christ's bride. That pure relationship of the church as Christ's spiritual bride is the goal of Christ's reconciliation with the church. In the last verse. If ye continue in the faith, grounded and settled, and be not moved away from the hope of the gospel which ye have heard, and which was preached to every creature which is under heaven, whereof I, Paul, am made a minister. Paul gave a condition for reconciliation, continuing the faith. And the Colossians' faith had to be grounded and settled. One of the main ways to do that is to set our hope on the gospel we have heard, including the truths about Jesus that Paul had just written about. Paul wasn't trying to inspire fear, but he did want the followers to keep what was already true about them. Now, as believers, we have to endure to the end, so we also have to be grounded and settled, but we also have to be steadfast. When Paul said, which was preached to every creature which is under heaven, he wasn't meaning that really literally. He was likely just emphasizing the cosmic impact of the gospel that he had already talked about in verse 20. And then at the end of the verse, because Colossians chapter 1 continues, of course, at the end of the verse, Paul's starting his transition from the content of the gospel to defending his role as a minister of that gospel. And what follows. All right, fall squirrel. Conclusions and takeaways. God's revealed himself in Jesus Christ. If we want to know what God's like, look at Jesus, because Jesus is God's perfect image. Jesus has power over everything in the universe, so we have nothing to fear in it. Some days that's a little harder to remember than others, huh? But even on our worst days, the world's continuing existence, such as it is, proves God's goodness to us. And Jesus is the head of the body and the source of the life of the church. Jesus is a true temple of God's presence, so we can receive forgiveness and mercy when we turn to him. And finally, we can persevere in faith by regularly reminding ourselves about the good news of Jesus. So, there are some bumps in that lesson, and some things I think I got more than others. So what did I miss? Rick, fill me in.
On verse 16 there, you talked about, where it's in earth, visible or visible and invisible, whether you got thrones, dominions, principalities, or powers.
Mm-hmm.
I think the literature talked about spiritual. I think it's more than that, okay? I think it's physical too, because here it says visible and non-visible. So I think God puts people in places of power to control this earth, all right? He did Nebuchadnezzar, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So I think he still does it today, all right? And puts people in power to get what he's trying to get, okay? And so, and another thing, are in earth. Now, how many times have you heard people say the Lord's Prayer on earth as it is in heaven? It's really in earth as it is in heaven, okay? And they speak of in earth, and in earth takes on a bigger picture than on earth, right?
Okay.
It encompasses all, where on earth could be a place, right? And so, I got confused on that one time and looked that up and tried to
Yeah, that is a little confusing.
summarize that. But every time I heard the Lord's Prayer that says in earth, they would say it on earth, right? And everybody would say it, right? Every time you hear someone saying it, in church or something, goes on with that. And when it goes down at the end on creatures,
Mhm.
in Romans, around about chapter 8, later part of chapter 8, Paul talks about the creatures, okay?
Mhm.
When God cursed the earth, he cursed the humans, and he cursed the whole creature nation,
Right.
which is the animals,
Mhm.
right? And it talks about even the creatures, animals, looking for the blessed, looking for the hope at the end of the salvation.
All of creation fell
Yeah,
under
all
curse.
three.
Everything.
So
Even the
I think
rocks,
it's,
everything.
I think it's more than, it's both human and animal kingdom that
I
he
think
refers to here.
Yeah, it's the earth as well.
Yeah.
I mean, everything fell under a curse. That's why weeds and everything grew up in the ground.
Right,
Every
just
single thing. You know, all of earth anxiously awaits his return,
And
so
it's
that
just-
everything can be
And
restored.
it's the same like with animals, defending themselves against humans at this
Mhm.
tight
Right.
time. But at the end, the lion will lay down with the lamb, all right? You know, so it all changes, the curse has been lifted. So,
Hallelujah.
so that's, you know, some of the things, even when I read some of the stuff, when it went to the spiritual, I thought, wait a minute, this is a little more than spiritual.
Mhm.
This is physical
Good
too,
point.
okay? So, just to be aware, you know,
Okay.
some commentaries and some comments doesn't totally explain everything.
Right.
Yeah. Anybody else? Okay. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Very good job.
Thank you. We'll take a short break. There's coffee and that.